السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أهلا بكم إلى هذه الحلقة من برنامج من الداخل عبر قناة الميادين. معكم زينب صفار. لعل إحدى المذكرات التي صدرت في أيلول سبتمبر عام 2010 من قبل إحدى المنظمات التي تعتمد على القوة الناعمة والتي تمولها الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، والتي ساعدت في تدريب زعيم الانقلاب الفنزويلي غوايدو وحلفائه، تحدد بوضوح أن الانهيار المحتمل للقطاع الكهربائي في البلاد هو نقطة تحول من المحتمل أن يكون لها تأثير في إثارة الاضطرابات العامة بطريقة لا يمكن لأي جماعة معارضة أن تأمل توليدها. ولعل هذه المذكرة تتمتع اليوم بأهمية خاصة مع تحرك غوايدو لاستغلال انقطاع التيار الكهربائي في جميع أنحاء البلاد بسبب عطل رئيسي في محطة سيمون بوليفار الكهربائية. منظمة مركز العمل والاستراتيجيات التطبيقية اللا عنفية أو كانفاس. من هي تلك المنظمة التي تحدثت عن هذا التكتيك منذ عام 2010؟ وما علاقة غوايدو بتلك المنظمة؟ وما هي أهدافها البعيدة المدى؟ للإجابة عن هذه الأسئلة وأكثر يطيب لنا أن نستقبل من مكتبنا في واشنطن دي سي ماكس بلومنثال، الصحفي الأمريكي الحائز على العديد من الجوائز والمؤلف للعديد من الكتب الأكثر مبيعا، وهو أيضا المؤسس لموقع Grayzone في عام 2015، المنصة الإخبارية المستقلة التي تنشر التحقيقات الصحفية المتعلقة بالحرب الدائمة الأمريكية وتبعاتها الداخلية الخطيرة. Max Blumenthal, award-winning journalist and author of several best-selling books, including The Management of Savagery, and founder of the Grayzone in 2015 to cast a journalistic light on America's state of perpetual war and its dangerous domestic repercussions. Welcome to من الداخل from the inside, Max.
Great to be on with you.
Pure pleasure to have you, Max. Well, allow me to ask you to tell us, first of all, about the September memo of 2010, which was published by WikiLeaks, where the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, better known as the Canvas, the leader of the center, Sergej Popovich, declared, quote, "A key to Chavez's current weakness is the decline in the electricity sector." It's very much relevant to what's taking place today in Venezuela. Before we delve in talking about this tactic, who is Canvas and what are their aims and what is their relation with Juan Guaido's rise to prominence, please?
That's an excellent question. Canvas was founded out of a group known as Otpor in Belgrade, Serbia. This organization, which was funded by United States soft power organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and was allegedly funded directly by the CIA, was the key group that the West used to topple Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic by stirring up street protests through tactics of hybrid warfare in the form of nonviolence. And those tactics became a model that the United States and its allies wanted to export around the world, anywhere that it sought regime change, from
like the color
Zimbabwe
revolutions
to Cuba to Nicaragua. And then, of course, you have the color revolutions across Eastern Europe, which was a model for Canvas. And so Canvas trained thousands of youth activists around the world to help spread the West's goals very successfully. And ultimately, after the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998 and the success of the Bolivarian Revolution, Canvas entered Venezuela in 2007 and began training a group of youth activists known as Generation 2007, led by Leopoldo Lopez, founder of the Popular Will Party, which Juan Guaido represents. He was the mentor of Guaido, and Guaido was trained by Canvas, the group that authored this very cynical and disturbing memo that you just quoted from.
I will come back to talk more about Canvas, but why do you think, Max, that the electricity outage is a pivotal stage in U.S. plans for regime change in Venezuela? And how did Senator Marco Rubio's prophecy, in this sense, play into this, and Juan Guaido's exploit this issue?
On March 7th, Marco Rubio led a session at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Venezuela, And it was at that session that he promised that Venezuela would enter a period of suffering unlike any nation in modern history. Those were his exact words.
This is the prophecy.
He also called for widespread unrest. The prophecy and his demand for widespread unrest across Venezuela. And it's obvious Marco Rubio's been getting briefings on what was to take place. 5 hours later, the hydroelectric dam at Guri, which is the main source of power for 80% of Venezuela, was collapsed, and a blackout began in 21 of 23 provinces across the country. I can't say for certain that the U.S. caused that hydroelectric dam to collapse, but the Venezuelan government has produced evidence that it has, and there were 3 stages in what they allege was an attack on the power plant. First was a cyber attack, then an electromagnetic pulse attack, and then sabotage of transmission lines. And the sabotage of transmission lines is well documented. We've seen burned transmission lines around the country, as well as attacks on the oil sector. The Venezuelan government and the people, through mass mobilization, managed to defeat the blackouts, get the metro in Caracas running again, for example. But then we saw, again, on March 23rd, more blackouts. And it suggests that there is, in fact, an attempt to cause widespread unrest in Venezuela from the outside.
Right. Now, why did the scenario that the leader of Canvas, Popovich, envisioned fail to materialize, in your opinion, in the year 2010?
Well, Sergei Popovich, who is the co-founder of Canvas and is now the rector, the president at St. Andrews University in Scotland, a country that he has never been lived in or been a part of, had predicted that the hydroelectric dam would collapse because of low water levels. But the electricity managed to remain on, and the activists that he trained as part of Generation 2007, Juan Guaido and company, moved on to different tactics of sabotage and destabilization, including the so-called guarimbas, which were blockades of opposition neighborhoods that led to violent attacks on the security services and even the killing of civilians who were allied with the Chavista movement. So basically what Popovich did was outline one of the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of the Venezuelan state under Chavez, and it's fairly clear that this memo, which was essentially a wider blueprint for regime change, has informed U.S. actions since the coup attempt began this January.
Right, terrific. Do you think, Max, that such a tactic would succeed in today's Venezuela led by Maduro, especially that while Venezuela's government and the Chavista movement proclaimed victory over the worst blackouts to plague the country, Washington's coup masters have promised more darkness until their goals are complete?
That's right. Elliot Abrams, who has basically been put in charge of Venezuelan policy by Donald Trump, someone who's very experienced in dirty wars across Latin America. He was an Iran-Contra figure. He also helped oversee the coup attempt in the Gaza Strip in 2007, I believe, has said at the State Department briefing last week that Venezuela would be experiencing more blackouts. How does Elliot Abrams know? Well, that's a good question, and it should have been asked to him. But in any case, we've published a detailed look at what life is like in Venezuela on the ground by a Venezuelan at the Grayzone.com, my website. And what you see in that article is how ordinary Venezuelans are working together as a community to survive these blackouts because they have a very strong conscience. They understand what's being done to them, and they've had a political education through the culture of Chavismo, and they see that if they cook food on firewood, if they help a neighbor charge their cell phone on their car, that is an act of resistance against the empire. And so defeating the Venezuelan state for the United States means defeating an entire culture that is part of the life of millions of Venezuelans. And then on the opposition side, you have very small protests. Juan Guaido is becoming an irrelevant figure, and the opposition in the U.S. seeks to get him arrested because he has very little use anymore, and they want to create another provocation.
Right. Allow us, Max, to stop now for a short break. And then afterwards, we're going to talk a bit more about the reaction of Popovich to what was published by the Grayzone. But after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. Max Blumenthal, award-winning journalist and author of several best-selling books, including The Management of Savagery, and the founder of the Grayzone. Welcome back to The Inside, sir. Well, since the Grayzone was the news website that you, Max, have founded, exposed the deep ties between Canvas and Guaido's popular Will Party, Popovich, the leader of Canvas, has attempted to publicly distance himself from his record of training Venezuela's opposition. Why?
Well, it's very embarrassing for someone who is now the rector of a major university to be exposed as part of a very cynical Trump administration plot to topple a government. But that's what Sergei Popovich has been doing throughout his entire career. In fact, Stratcom, the so-called private CIA that was involved in some of the training sessions that Canvas ran, said that Canvas was basically a bunch of former youth activists who put on suits and went about helping the CIA topple governments by training the youth in countries that the U.S. doesn't like. Those were almost the exact words. And what Popovich said was really interesting in a website called Balkan Insight when he was asked, "Did you train Juan Guaido?" And he said Juan Guaido has never been to Belgrade for training sessions. So it was basically a non-denial denial, where in fact Juan Guaido participated allegedly in the 2010 training sessions overseen by Canvas, funded by the United States and Venezuelan oligarchs like Pedro Borelli at the La Mexicana Hotel in Cancun, Mexico. And when we reported that, Pedro Borelli, who's now at Georgetown University's Latin American Studies Center here in Washington, reached out to us, me and my co-author, Dan Cohen, and confessed that, yes, I support what Canvas does. Yes, I participated in those sessions. Yes, they took place. So we pretty much have confirmation that Guaido was involved in this. And that's what his party is. The Popular Will Party of Juan Guaido is a U.S. creation. It was created to destabilize Venezuela from within. They've had a lot of effect. Many people have died and many people have suffered as a result of their destabilization attempts.
What about
and I saw who their constituents were when I was in Caracas. It is the, yeah.
What about
Go
its
ahead.
relation to the CIA, Max?
Well, we've had a former Otpor activist in Canvas state that the CIA did fund their activities. The CIA is obviously heavily involved in the coup attempt in Venezuela. And when you look at the funding of political parties in Venezuela and civil society groups that are allied with the opposition, it's very much like the White Helmets in Syria or many of the groups that helped lead color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. They're funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and a group called the National Endowment for Democracy. And when the National Endowment for Democracy was created, it was after a period of when CIA abuse was exposed by Congress. And so they were created to do what the CIA did covertly, but to do so overtly by openly funding opposition movements. And that's not me saying that. That's a former director of the National Endowment for Democracy, Alan Weinstein, to the Washington Post in 1991. So this essentially is a cutout of the CIA acting in the open for everyone to see. And for some reason, U.S. reporters don't think there's anything scandalous about that.
Now, Max, you have joined a panel titled Humanitarian Crisis in Venezuela, Propaganda versus Reality at the United Nations Human Rights Council session in Geneva last March. What issues have you underscored? I mean, during the electricity outage, Western media exploited the situation to amplify the narrative of a humanitarian crisis and portray a nation submerged in chaos and had descended into the, quote, low of the jungle, as the New York Times correspondent put it.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And what I aim to do at this panel, which was a side event at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, was to show the lies of corporate media, to hype up the concept of a humanitarian crisis, which then creates momentum for the U.S. to intervene militarily and otherwise. And I showed a photograph that had been widely distributed, including by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, of the Tienditas Bridge. And it shows 2 trucks on the bridge that have blocked the bridge. And the idea behind that photo is to show that Maduro is so cruel, he won't allow aid into the country, even though he's allowed Red Cross aid, Chinese aid, Russian aid. And they have their own free food delivery system in Venezuela. And what I showed is that that bridge has never, ever been used since it was built in 2015. It wasn't recently blocked. Another image that I pointed to, which was highlighted by many Western media organizations, was of Venezuelans drinking out of a freshwater spring during the blackout, because those who live uphill in Venezuela lost water supply because of the water pumps. They needed to be supplied by electricity. So they went to a freshwater spring over a river, and the way that the Western media portrayed it was that they were reduced to drinking sewage, which is such an insult to the poor and working people of Venezuela. They would never drink sewage. So I pointed out these lies, as well as explaining what the situation was like as I saw it on the ground, where I saw a still functional society.
What about, Max, the fundamental work of the Committees of Local Supply and Production, CLAP, in this regard?
Yeah, I did several videos that you can see at our YouTube channel at the Grayzone on the CLAP program. And this is a program of basically delivering food across the country to over 6 million Venezuelans that benefit from it. And the food comes in a box of sanitary supplies and basic foods. And it's helped basically keep people going amidst an economic crisis. This is the real humanitarian aid. The Venezuelan government has been able to double the supply of CLAP so that people receive it twice a month. And I also went to some open-air food markets in poor and working-class neighborhoods all around Caracas, where all kinds of food is put on sale at well below market value thanks to state subsidies. Now, the subsidies come out of PDVSA, which is the state oil company, and that's what the U.S. aims to attack and to sanction to prevent these programs from taking place. And many Venezuelans know, especially the working people and the poor, they know that if Juan Guaido comes into power, these programs, along with their free housing, their free health care, and their free education will be taken away. And that's why they're willing to fight that.
Now, despite the deployment of all mechanisms of economic suffocation against the country, and despite the escalation of the tactics of diplomatic and public relations harassment with the intention of isolating Venezuela internationally through the media, through statements by, as you said, Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Elliot Abrams, Mr. Bolton, yet this plan has suffered multiple failures. Why?
It's suffered multiple failures because Maduro is not some dictator acting against his own people. He is actually elected with a massive popular base that has a consciousness and a political education that is deeply anti-imperialist. Beyond that, the opposition is fragmented, and while Juan Guaido has been appointed by the U.S. as leader of the opposition, there is also a moderate opposition that's willing to negotiate, that is non-interventionist, and that could potentially produce a dialogue that will lead the way out of this crisis. It has also failed because the world is changing, and we saw the Turkish foreign minister in Washington at NATO's 70th anniversary conference yesterday declare that he will accept S-400 anti-aircraft batteries from Russia, despite what the U.S. says. Turkey has become a key partner of Venezuela. India is buying hundreds of thousands of barrels of Venezuelan oil. China and Russia are stepping up to support Venezuela. And so the world is changing. The U.S. empire is weakening, and Venezuela's government understands that. And that's why I think the U.S. has underestimated them and overestimated its own ability to do what it used to be able to do in Latin America.
Right. In talking about the international support to Venezuela. Experts point out that Europe is being pressed to side with the US in this cold economic war against Russia and China. And in order to compel Europe in this direction, the US is prepared to split the EU, taking the East into its anti-Russia, anti-China polarization in order to get its way. Now, observers say that Venezuela is an opportunity for both Russia and China to assume the leadership of the world. Do you think that they will seize the opportunity and thereby fundamentally change the world?
Well, it was already clear that Russia was going to seize the opportunity when it sent two of its most advanced bomber jets to land in Venezuela. This was a statement to the U.S. that it would stand up against a coup and defend this state with which it has relations. China has over $70 billion of investment in the Venezuelan oil sector, and they want to protect that. But there's also a broader principle that was outlined at the United Nations in February by Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza, and that is about the UN Charter and those principles that are so sacred to the UN Charter of non-interference, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. And those are principles that China and particularly Russia believe strongly in because they have been interfered with so strongly. And what Arreaza managed to do is establish a bloc at the UN of nations that want their sovereignty respected, including Syria. And this is a new non-aligned movement that we've seen come to bear thanks to the efforts of Arreaza and the support that he's received from so many states, including African states that are never talked about in the U.S. So we're absolutely seeing the world change. Venezuela is the front line of the resistance to empire, and we're witnessing the dawn of a new reality there.
Right, Max Blumenthal, award-winning journalist and founder of the Grayzone. Many thanks indeed for joining us from our offices in Washington, D.C.
Thanks to you.
Right, والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا The Inside @الميادين.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل من كل فريق عمل البرنامج من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.